3 times a day in our prayers, we say, Yerushalayim ircha b'rachamim tashuv. We ask God to return to your city, Jerusalem, with mercy. And for many years, I would say those words whenever I would say the Amidah, and I said them as a good Jew and just said the words and, didn't really think all that much of it. But the last time I was in Israel, that was in January 2020, I went to visit my son who was studying there for the year. And I had the privilege of spending Shabbat in the old city of Jerusalem, something I had never done before. And as part of the Shabbaton, as part of the weekend, we were given the chance to take a walking tour on Shabbat afternoon of the Muslim quarter of the old city. I had never been there before, and we were with a tour guide who knew what he was doing, who knew his way around. And so he showed us the Jewish points of interest in the Muslim quarter. And so as we're walking around, he stops at one apartment building, knocks at the door. A Jewish family opens the door, and he says, Shabbat Shalom, I'd like to take my friends here up to the roof. Would that be okay? And they said, absolutely, go right ahead. So we climbed up, 4 or 5 flights of slightly rickety stairs, and we get to the roof. And we walked out and we looked upon the most beautiful panoramic 360-degree view of the old city of Jerusalem that I had ever in my life seen. Now, it was Shabbat. I couldn't take pictures, but I took a mental picture. And that mental picture has stayed with me for in the years that have passed. And now, whenever I say those words, Yerushalayim ircha b'rachamim tashuv, God, return to Jerusalem, your dwelling place, with mercy, I have that image in my mind. And I think of the majesty and the glory of the city of Jerusalem. We as a synagogue, we talk a lot about God. And we strive to feel God with us at all times. But sometimes we all doubt. We all wonder, is there really a God? Is he really listening? Does he really control things up there? Is there really somebody listening as I pour my heart out whenever I come to pray? Well, if you needed proof of the existence of a God, all you need to do is look to the events of June 1967. Against all odds, Israel won the Six-Day War in a grand fashion. And the old city of Jerusalem, of which we had dreamed for 2,000 years, fell into Israeli control and into Jewish control once again. So today is Yom Yerushalayim. It begins this evening. And on this day, we celebrate those miracles. We celebrate that victory. We celebrate those amazing events that took place in 1967. And as we begin Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, a day on which we celebrate our control over Yerushalayim, we're going to kick off that celebration tonight by watching a few videos, which I hope will give us a little perspective of our celebration today. And I'm going to begin with a video put together just a couple of days ago by the World Mizrahi Foundation. That is a foundation put together by religious Zionists, believing that, yes, it's wonderful that we have Israel. It's wonderful that we have Jerusalem. But there's a lot more to the events of the Six-Day War in 1967 that meet the eye. And it is very, very clear that there was a heavenly force which made it all possible. Here's a history lesson to give us a little bit of perspective on Yom Yerushalayim.
There is no rational way to explain the remarkable circumstances that led to the liberation of the old city of Jerusalem in 1967. It was one of the most unexpected and inexplicable phenomena in the history of human warfare. There was no battle plan for Jerusalem whatsoever. Israeli intelligence never expected the impending confrontation to include Jordan, which had been in control of the Old City since 1948. In the south, Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, in contravention of international law, had closed the Straits of Tiran and sent 100,000 troops and thousands of tanks into the demilitarized Sinai Peninsula, a clear act of war. Tensions were also building on the Syrian border in the north. Israel expected a war on two fronts, north and south, but certainly not with Jordan in the east. Unbeknown to Israel, Jordan had signed an agreement with Egypt, placing the entire Jordanian army under the direct command of Egypt's chief of staff, General Riyad. It was Nasser's plan to unleash a triple-pronged attack from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which he believed the young state of Israel could not defend, and he would finally avenge the defeat of 1948. On the first day of the war, the Jordanian forces began shelling major cities across Israel, including heavy bombardment of Jewish West Jerusalem. Israel repeatedly implored the Jordanians to cease fire and promised they would not react. Once all diplomatic attempts failed, Israel had no choice but to defend herself and enter the unplanned fray in Jerusalem. Rabbi Yoel bin Nun, a member of the Paratrooper Reserve Brigade 55 under the command of Mota Gur, recalls the surprising change in plan. On the first day of the war, he and his fellow soldiers were en route to El Arish in Sinai when they received an urgent command to redirect to Jerusalem. The IDF now had only a few hours to familiarize themselves with the routes and topography in and around the capital. With only partial intelligence, a dire lack of East Jerusalem maps, and in complete darkness, the troops charged into battle at 2 a.m. early Tuesday morning on the second day of the war. It was then the paratroopers engaged in the fierce battles of Ammunition Hill, the American colony, and Wadi Joz, and suffered the worst day of losses in their unit's entire history, losing 100 soldiers in these battles. In comparison, the very same brigade fought for 2 weeks in the Yom Kippur War and lost 52 soldiers, half of those lost on this one blood-drenched day. However, despite the heavy price, Brigade 55, together with the Harel and Jerusalem brigades, had almost surrounded the Old City. That very night, Mota Gur had a breathtaking conversation with Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi of the IDF. While in the Rockefeller Museum at the northeastern tip of the Old City, awaiting orders, the rabbi said to him, "Mota, Jewish history obligates you to liberate the Old City." Mota replied that while he draws great inspiration from Jewish history, he takes his orders only from his superiors. "Mota," said Rav Goren, "Jewish history will not forgive a Jewish commander who had the opportunity to reclaim Jerusalem and did not do so." Moshe Dayan, the defense minister in the unity government, had ordered them not to capture the Old City for two reasons. Firstly, the intention of this defensive war was never to conquer the Old City and its holy sites, sacred to many religions. Secondly, he was aware of the large Jordanian military presence in the Old City, especially on the Temple Mount, with huge amounts of artillery and ammunition. Having seen the devastating losses on that one day, Dayan anticipated much greater losses in hand-to-hand street combat, especially in defense of the holy places. This would be a battle that Israel would not fight, or so he thought. What he did not realize was, in Rav Soloveitchik's famous words, that divine destiny was knocking at the door. The drama of Jewish destiny was about to unfold. That very same night, two utterly unexpected and unpredictable events occurred. The first, in a remarkable display of unity, left-wing Yigal Allon and Menachem Begin from the right came together as one to Prime Minister Levi Eshkol to intercede on behalf of Jerusalem. Now was the time to liberate the holy city. The emergency cabinet heavily debated the issue, with many concerned that the world would not tolerate a Jewish conquest of Jerusalem and that Israel should not attack. Eventually, Moshe Dayan's decision was overruled and the cabinet gave the green light. It was time to return to Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years, at any cost. At that very same time, another dramatic decision was being made. The commander of the Jordanian troops in the Old City, sensing the inevitable and realizing he was surrounded, requested permission to retreat over the Mount of Olives and back over the Jordan River. General Riyad gave his approval, and the Jordanians fled that very same evening. Our sages describe how Jerusalem is the only city in the world that exists on two planes, in heaven and on earth. Jerusalem on high and Jerusalem down below. Nothing happens in Jerusalem on high unless it happens concurrently in Jerusalem below. Perhaps at the very moment of both debates between the rabbi and the commander and within the cabinet in the city below, a similar debate was taking place in the heavenly cabinet. Were the Jewish people worthy of returning to Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh? Was this the moment they'd been waiting for 2,000 years? Or would they have to wait 2,000 more? Would there be more devastating loss of life in a battle on the mountain of God? Or would there be a more merciful outcome? As we know, divine mercy won the day. Am Yisrael would not have to wait any longer, and little blood would be spilt on that epic day in Jerusalem in June 1967. The hand of heaven was moving history forward. When Motagur positioned himself on the Mount of Olives the next morning, preparing for the battle of his life, he was astounded. There was barely a Jordanian soldier in sight. After a few minor skirmishes, and mercifully with very little loss of life, Motagur proclaimed the iconic words, Har Habayit B'Yadeinu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. Israel had accomplished what seemed impossible with all the political predictions and military assessments from just a few days before. The Jewish people had returned home.
אני יורד ברגע זה, אני יורד המדרגות אל הכותל. אינני אדם דתי, לעולם לא הייתי, אבל זהו הכותל, ואני נוגע באבני הכותל המערבי.
Extraordinary turn of events is another powerful reminder of the meaning of Jewish life. Our collective journey on earth cannot be separated from our heavenly odyssey. Individual and national master plans cannot be severed from the master's plan. The very existence of Israel and Jerusalem is a constant testimony to the inextricable bond between human history and divine providence, between Jewish destiny and our spiritual destination.
It's very powerful to see soldiers, chayalim, who had never uttered a bracha in their entire lives, never said a blessing, never said a prayer, to have reached the Western Wall and to say Shechianu and blow the shofar and truly, truly understand the significance of the day that they had witnessed. We all take for granted the idea that we go visit Israel and we get off the plane, and maybe 2 hours later, we can visit the Western Wall. But it wasn't always like that. And that is the miracle that we celebrate today on Yom Yerushalayim. Along those same lines, some of you may know that in our building, we're getting ready to hopefully return to the synagogue, to our beloved home on Little Neck Parkway. In our building, I believe right next to Rabbi Yafi's office, there is a photo, that iconic photo of 3 Israeli soldiers staring up at the Western Wall, which they had the opportunity to come close to for the first time in their lives. And right next to it, there's another photo that was taken 50 years later. Well, I have a very short video also from the Mizrahi Foundation of how that second photo came to be. And it's part of a longer commercial of a mission that they were doing in honor of Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day in 2017. But I just wanted you to be able to see the soldiers of 1967 then and now.
The 3 of us, Zion, Chaim, and myself, Itzhak, are returning once again 50 years later to our holiest site where history was made. Please join us from all over the world to take a picture with us and to relive this moment.
אנחנו בתוך העיר העתיקה.
הר הבית בידינו, כאן תלמיד, הר הבית בידינו.
שמה הניפו את הדגל, שתדעו כולם, בפינה הזאת. שלום לכל יהודי התפוצות, לכל קהילות המזרחי בעולם. לאחר כמיהה של 2000 שנה והקרב על ירושלים, הר הבית והכותל המערבי, והבאנו את הקדושה לעם ישראל, אנו מזמינים אתכם לחגיגות ה50 שנה לייחודה של ירושלים, בירתה של ארץ ישראל, לדור דור ונצח נצחים. עם ישראל חי!
Not every day does a
Okay, that's all we need to see. The rest is just a commercial for their mission. The last video that I'd like to show you today, I think the last video, we'll see how time permits, but comes from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And over the past several months, we on our Wednesday evening class in Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, have studied the wisdom of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of Israel, who unfortunately passed away this past year and left a tremendous hole in Jewish thought and Jewish leadership. Rabbi Sachs always had the words to say. He always was able to speak with such eloquence and to help us understand complex thought in words that just made so much sense. So it only makes sense that on the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem in 2017, they asked Rabbi Sachs for his thoughts on that very, very special occasion of 50 years since the liberation of Jerusalem. So I'd like to show you now Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs on Yom Yerushalayim, on his thoughts 50 years later.
There has never been a love story like it in all of history, the love of this people for that city. Jerusalem is mentioned something like 660 times in Tanakh. And even though the temple was destroyed twice, and even though the city has been besieged 23 times and captured and reconquered 44 times, Jews never ceased to pray for Jerusalem, about Jerusalem, and facing Jerusalem. Somehow it was where every Jewish prayer met and ascended to heaven. And there's been nothing like it. Other cities, other faiths may hold Jerusalem holy, but they have holier places. Rome, Constantinople, Mecca, Medina. Jews only had this one city. A tiny city, but somehow it was the place, said Maimonides, from which the divine presence was never exiled. In those critical and tense weeks before the Six-Day War, I was just coming near the end of my first undergraduate year at Cambridge University. And for the 3 weeks beforehand, we all felt that something terrible was going to happen after all the troops were massed on the Egyptian and Syrian borders. And all of us, all of my generation born after the Holocaust, feared that we were about to witness a second Holocaust. All the Jewish students, vast numbers of them, turned up in the little shul in Thompson's Lane to pray. I've never seen so many people there before or since. The atmosphere was absolutely intense. And for me, it was life-changing. As soon as we saw the paratroopers, as soon as we heard the words Har Habayit Biyadenu, I knew I had to go there and see it for myself. And I went there, and looking down from Har HaTzofim, from Mount Scopus, down on the old city, I suddenly realized that I was standing at the very place that the Mishnah and Gemara talk about at the end of Makot, when Rabbi Akiva and 3 of his rabbinical colleagues are standing on Har HaTzofim, looking down on the ruins of the temple, and the other rabbis are weeping, and Rabbi Akiva is smiling. And he says, "Why are you weeping?" And they say, "Look, the Holy of Holies, and it's ruins. A fox is walking through there." the place that only the holiest man, the high priest, could enter only on the holiest day, and now it's ruins. Of course we're weeping. Why are you not weeping? And Rabbi Akiva said, because there were two prophets who gave prophecies. One, Micha, saw the city in its destruction, and another one, Zechariah, saw it rebuilt, and saw it as a place where Od Yeshvu Zakenim Uzakenot, Berchovot Yerushalayim, where old men and women would sit at peace in the streets of Jerusalem, and the streets would be filled with the sounds of children playing. So if I have seen the fulfillment of the prophecy of destruction, am I not convinced that there will one day come true the prophecy of rebuilding and restoration? And as I stood where Rabbi Akiva stood 2,000 years earlier, I said to myself, if he had only known how long it would take, would he still have believed? And then I suddenly realized, of course he would still have believed, because Jews would never give up hope of Jerusalem. We never allowed it to escape our minds. In any of our prayers, at our weddings, we remember Jerusalem. Every time we comfort mourners, we say, Hamakom yanachem etchem b'toch sha'avelei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. You know, Jews were a circumference whose center was Jerusalem. And I suddenly realized that people that could never forget this holy city would one day come back. And as I stood there, soon after the 6-Day War, I suddenly realized that faith brought back Jews to Jerusalem and will one day rebuild its ruins. That is the most powerful testimony of faith I know. What's special about Jerusalem today is, despite all the tensions which are real, nonetheless, it's a place, the Holy of Holies, still to Jews. But also on the Temple Mount are 2 mosques. It's a place of prayer for Muslims. There in the old city are some of the holiest churches in the whole of Christendom. So it is, nonetheless, a city of peace. One of the very few places in the Middle East, one of the very few places in the world, holy to 3 distinct faiths, where those faiths pray together in freedom and in peace. And that's come only under Israeli rule in the last 50 years. Somebody once said about Israel, and you could certainly say this about Jerusalem, that it's not that long and it's not that wide, but it's very deep. So Jerusalem is very deep, and somehow within its relatively narrow confines, it contains, in Walt Whitman's phrase, multitudes. The other incredible thing about Jerusalem is that somehow magic happens with our sense of time. So for instance, the walls of Jerusalem were destroyed by every conqueror and then rebuilt using the stones that had the previous walls. So if you look at the stones of the walls around Jerusalem, they come from all the eras, somehow past and present, the old and the new are all jumbled together. And then you think of this city, the oldest of the old, and yet Time magazine a couple of years ago listed Jerusalem as one of the top 5 in the world, which is an emerging center of high tech. So it's the oldest of the old, and it's the newest of the new. It is the living symbol of what Theodor Herzl titled his book about the return to Zion, Alt Neuland, the old new land, the old new city for the old and renewed people.
An amazing story, an amazing city, an amazing miracle that we celebrate this evening on Yom Yerushalayim. I hope that you've been inspired by this little introduction that we've prepared to help get you ready for Yom Yerushalayim, to help you truly understand the significance of this day. We're about to daven mincha, and as we do, we will say those words with which I began tonight. V'Yerushalayim ircha b'rachamim tashuv. God, we ask that you return to Jerusalem with mercy. Well, it's pretty clear to me that God has returned to Jerusalem. If not fully, then partially. We still have a ways to go, and that is very much evidenced by the events of this past weekend. Jerusalem has been the scene of a good amount of violence in recent days and weeks. And maybe that's why we still have to pray. Yerushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv. God, fully restore yourself to Jerusalem. Bring yourself back to Jerusalem. Let's have a Jerusalem which really lives up to its promise in full, of a place of peace and harmony and goodness, a place that we can all share, a place that we can all believe in, a place where we know we can be safe and secure and practice Judaism in the way it was meant to be practiced. Maybe that's what we pray for 3 times a day, and maybe that's what we'll continue to pray for until the coming of the Mashiach. So we will break now for a short mincha minyan, and after we daven together, we will hear a little bit about Israel bonds, and then we'll have the opportunity to hear from our guest speaker this evening. Rabbi Yafi has joined us. He made it in from his destination, and I will turn the program over to him right now.
Well, thank you, Cantor Sharon. Yes, I was in the traffic in New Jersey, and it's really quite heavy out there. But I'm glad to be here, safe and sound, and a very special evening, Yom Yerushalayim. I hope that the program was taped, and so I, along with all of those who were not able to make it, will be able to participate in that. But this program is our annual Israel Bond program. Every year we have an Israel Bond breakfast, and as a small synagogue, we can all be very proud of the kind of connection that we have had for decades, supporting the state of Israel through investment. And tonight we have Robert Lunzer, our personal representative of Israel Bonds, to share with us a few ideas about Israel Bonds and to give us the opportunity to make a commitment to invest and to make that bond, that personal bond between us and the state of Israel. So without any further ado, we'd like to call upon Robert Lunzer. And Josh, you got him?
Thank you.
He should be good.
I got him.
Thank you.
There you are.
Good evening, everyone. And for those of you who are mothers and grandmothers and mother-in-laws, we have about an hour and 10 minutes until the sun goes down. So happy Mother's Day to all of you. We hope you all had a nice time. I also was stuck in traffic coming from the Lower East Side, but I made it a few hours before to make sure that I'll be here on time. First and foremost, I want to thank the Men's Club, Gerald Schwartz, Erwin Tobin, and Rabbi Yafi for allowing us to not let another year go by without the Israel Bonds family joining you, as we have for the past 4 decades. I just spoke to Don Foreman. He's going to try to come on. He has some things that didn't get finished in time, but he sends his regards to everyone. So basically, you all know all about Israel Bonds. I see from the participants that most of you are regular bond buyers. For those 10 or 12 of you that are new, just a brief summary of who we are. And I strongly recommend that if you've never bought a bond, that you please check our israelbond.com website. We also sent out a video to many of you about who we are. So basically, Israel Bonds is not a charity. Israel Bonds is an investment in the state of Israel. You lend Israel money, we give you back the money in a certain period of time, 2, 3, 5, 10, or 15 years. You should have received a mailing from me in most cases of my current offerings. We do adjust our rates every 2 weeks, except for the Mazel Tov bond, which is the gift-giving bond, which I'm going to speak about in a moment, which is the most important feature of our offerings in our opinion. So again, Israel Bonds is a loan to the state of Israel. It is paid back in a certain period of time. It is available through your IRAs, your foundations, your pension plans. But most important, which I said a moment ago, we want you to use it as a means of giving it for family smachot, for bris, for newborns, for weddings, for graduations that are coming up. The minimum purchase is $100, $10 increments thereafter. And basically what we're trying to do, and this is what Little Neck Congregation Lador Vador has done for 4 decades now, and that is that everybody tries to participate according to their means. We're not looking for the big bucks. We're looking for the database to be increased for your children and your grandchildren who will ultimately get the bond to continue in your footsteps. Many of you may have heard that last year, because of the COVID crisis, sometime in the middle of the summer, the state of Israel, the Treasury, our boss, asked us to raise an extra $500 million above the $1 billion that we have been doing for the last 6 years with your help. And with our rates being so bad and with people losing jobs, Baruch Hashem, thank God, we were able to raise that extra $500 million. But most of that, I must say, did not come from individuals like yourself or myself. It came from banks, institutions, and state pension plans. When you speak to your congressmen or your senators, you can be very proud of New York State, who bought over $60 million last year in Israel bonds and $30 million, I believe, this year already. So again, the idea is to just buy something. Many of you have bought already this year. The rabbi has put my number in numerous emails. We'll be sending around a little notice in Temple Talk this Shabbat as well. So we really hope that everybody will help out. Unfortunately, the budget has been cut by the state of Israel. We lost 15 employees in February. The first time we've had a retrenchment in over 12 years is in Israel bonds. We've closed 8 regional small satellite offices. So we're doing our part. Unfortunately, it has hurt us. Many of us were people that I've been with for the last 30 years. I've now had 30 years, my 30th anniversary in February with Israel bonds, and I'm pleased that 29 of those 30, I've had the privilege of working with Don and all of you and Rabbi Eckstein over the years, and we've had a great, great relationship. So I would like the program to move along. We have an extremely talented and influential speaker that Gerald came up with. So please, all we ask is that you consider buying a bond. Be in touch with me. For those of you who have a pen, just write down my number. I am working remotely since Shushan Purim last year at 646-523-1939, 646-523-1939. And please, whatever the amount is, just do something and join the honor roll, which in about 3 weeks from now, we usually post in the Temple Talk without amounts, just as an appreciation of showing who participated. Again, enjoy the evening. Thank you for allowing us to co-sponsor this evening, and Chag Sameach to everyone.
Robert, thank you. Robert mentioned the Mazel Tov bonds, and I just would like to say from a personal perspective that whenever we have a gift to give, giving, you can write a check, but you can also write that check to the state of Israel and give the couple or the baby or the bar mitzvah or wherever you're going, you can give them a bond. Because not only is the bond a bond with Israel, it's an investment. and it is really a great way to make that bond yourself with Israel, and for the person that's getting it, it's really a meaningful gift, and it's no less than giving a check. It's the same money, but in just a different way. But the reality is that because of that, we are able to support all of the things that Israel needs to be the light unto the nation that she is, the homeland for our people, and the dawn, indeed, of our redemption. So I want to thank Robert for joining us, and I hope that, as Robert said, it's not how much, it's the goal towards 100% participation, and that is something that builds a sense of community, which is what our congregation is really all about. So with that, I'm looking at our attendance here, and I'm looking for Itzhak, Dr. Brook, and I don't, oh yes, there he is. Okay, good. So at this time, I would like to call on, let's see, Jerry Schwartz to introduce our speaker this evening. And as has been said, tonight we are, this program is being co-sponsored by the Men's Club and by Israel Buns. So on behalf of the Men's Club, I call upon Jerry Schwartz, who is working together with Erwin Tobin, who is in Israel. And we've promised him that this program will be recorded, so he will be able to see it, because right now in Israel, it is 7 hours later, which is what, 3 a.m. or something like that. So Jerry, it's all yours.
Before I introduce Dr. Brook, I just want to let everybody know that there will be a question and answer period at the conclusion of his presentation. And those of you who do have questions, please raise your hand and you will be recognized. Dr. Itzhak Brook is a professor of pediatrics at George Washington University School of Medicine in Washington, D.C. He was born and raised in Haifa, Israel, and earned his medical degree from Hebrew University, Hadassah School of Medicine in Jerusalem. He served in the Israeli army as a medic in the Six-Day War in 1967 and as a battalion physician during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Subsequently, he completed a fellowship in adult and pediatric infectious diseases at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine. He served in the Medical Corps of the U.S. Navy for 27 years. I thank you for your service. Dr. Brook has authored several hundred publications in scientific journals and 10 textbooks. He authored the books In the Sands of Sinai, a physician's account of the Yom Kippur War, and My Voice, a physician's personal experience with throat cancer. Dr. Brook is a speaker for the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C., and is a board of directors friends of the Yom Kippur War Center. So without further ado, Dr. Brook, please begin your presentation. Thank you.
Wait a minute. You are muted. Hold on.
Good evening to you, and it's a special privilege to address you tonight on the eve of Yom Yerushalayim, which commemorates events more than 50 years ago, 54 years ago, when the city was reunited
and we were finally able to get to the Western Wall. I had the privilege of being then in Jerusalem, and as you can hear later in my talk, I will talk to you about the feelings that we all had on the day that the city was united. But tonight I want to talk to you about a very painful experience and difficult time in Israel during the Yom Kippur War. I will divide my presentation into 3 parts. The first part will be a short 5-minute video, which is a recap of the Yom Kippur War. Then I will give you a pre-recorded presentation of my talk, which is about 40 minutes. And to make it easier for you to understand me, I have introduced captions, and later on we will be able to talk about it and answer questions, and I will be very glad to hear what you have to say and question. So let me start by sharing my screen and showing you the video.
In September 1973, Israeli intelligence observed a buildup of forces along the Syrian and Egyptian front lines. It was not viewed seriously.
A month before the war, we got similar information. And the army and the leadership took it very seriously. And then nothing happened. So when it came the second time, it wasn't taken seriously.
At 2 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, Egypt and Syria launched their onslaught. Tens of thousands of Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal. Most of the Israeli line of fortresses along the canal collapsed. The Egyptian forces appeared unstoppable.
They had the feeling that they are winning. Our forces, for the first time, suddenly felt that they cannot stop the Egyptians.
The morale was so high of everyone, even who lost his sight, even who was with amputated legs, but very happy that he has done something for his country.
In the north, Syrian artillery troops and armor blasted Israeli positions on the Golan Heights. Israeli tanks were outnumbered 10 to 1. The north of the country was at risk. Israeli armored forces stormed across the Sinai Desert to retake positions. But Sager rockets fired by Egyptian infantry proved deadly against the Israeli tanks. Previously undefeatable Israeli pilots now faced a new reality. Egyptian SAM missiles brought down dozens of Israeli jets.
I remember coming to the canal when I arrived in my division after 24 hours of going with our tanks across the desert on chains. I saw a young officer. He said, he looked at me, was like that. And he could not believe. He said, we cannot stop them. We cannot stop them.
Egyptian and Israeli tanks engaged in the Sinai. It was the largest clash of armor since the World War II Battle of El Alamein. The Egyptian advance was contained. In the north, Israel turned the Syrians back to the 1967 lines and then continued to push deep into Syrian territory. The turning point in the south came when General Ariel Sharon decided to attack the Egyptians from the rear. The building of the bridgehead across the Suez Canal took place under a massive artillery barrage.
It was a terrible night. I think that night we lost, from my division, about 300 killed and around 1,000 wounded. And all of us, from soldiers to the divisional commander, we all were fighting there. It was maybe the most terrible night I've ever seen.
Sharon's plan succeeded. Israel advanced into Egypt, cutting off tens of thousands of Egyptian troops in the Sinai. A ceasefire came into effect. The price of war had been devastating. 2,700 Israelis killed and thousands more wounded. More than 18,000 Arab soldiers had lost their lives.
It was war, really, of soldiers, because the courage and the sacrifice that they had to show was unbelievable. They did it. I speak about fathers of 4 and 5 and 6 children who were fighting. And I may call it even the war of fathers and sons.
That history
Israeli and Egyptian officers signed a ceasefire.
One day that the initial step towards understanding, reconciliation, and peace in the Middle East began here at kilometer 101.
The 1973 war left Israelis grim and somber. The dead and wounded, the grief and shock had taken a heavy physical and psychological toll. Soldiers and officers returning from the front were bitter. Many staged demonstrations. They asked who was responsible.
I'm going to speak to you today about the Yom Kippur War, the history, and my personal experience as battalion physician. But before I start, a few words about my voice. As you can see and hear, I have a very unique voice. and they were always ready to fight. But they also made maneuvers a couple of times in 1973. But the Israeli government called the reserves on one of those occasions, and when nothing happened, they decided not to take the threat seriously. Other signs were that the Russian advisors of Syria and Egypt sent their families back a week before Yom Kippur. A spy that was giving Israel very useful information, who was the son-in-law of the late President Nasser, warned Israel that war is imminent as did the King of Jordan, who personally informed Golda Meir about it. So why didn't Israel prepare and call the reserves, or to even strike a preemptive strike? The main reason is that the Israeli military and government and public was completely sure and overconfident in their strength. The unbelievable victory only 6.5 years earlier in the Six-Day War made Israeli feeling that they were invincible. They looked down upon their adversary and they decided that they could not threaten them because they are inferior in the quality, which is of course the worst thing any military or government should do. But another reason that Israel did not believe in this is that there was a theory developed by the Israeli head of military intelligence, General Zeira, that the Egyptian and Syrian would not attack until they have sufficient quantities of airplanes and other measures to defeat Israel. And that what has not happened. But what Israel did not take into account any other date of the year calendar, the situation would have been much, much more serious. Fortunately for Israel, even though they suffered tremendous casualties, the military won an unbelievable victory. We ended up at the outskirts of Cairo and Damascus, and the war, however, was regarded and is regarded until today as a disaster because of the tremendous amount of casualties for such a small nation. A nation of 3 million Jews suffered 3,000 casualties within 17 days of war. Almost every household knew somebody or suffered some kind of casualty. My high school in Haifa, a high school of about 150 graduates a year, and 73 graduates die during the Yom Kippur War.
5%.
If there's anything positive about the war, it is that peace with Egypt was signed 7 years later,
Yeah, she's alone. That's like the top.
and peace with Jordan was signed 20 years later. Why did the Arabs agree to sign peace up with Israel? Egypt did it because they considered the October War, as they call it, a victory and success. I, of course, walked with my wife and 2 children to the meeting place. And as we walked, it dawned on me that unlike the 6-day war, this time I'm also going to fight for my children, to protect them. And I hoped and prayed that I would come back alive from where in my head. And one event is etched in me that I can never forget. We evacuated a group of wounded soldiers to a field hospital, and as I walked out, I saw the side of the hospital tent, a row of stretchers, and each of them was covered with a blanket, and the only thing I could see were the shoes. Some of them were brown paratroopers, some were black armor or artillery, and I knew I'm privy to a tragedy that even the family of those men don't even know. And in a few hours somebody will knock on Nixon, who was very pragmatic, saw the conflict between Israel and Arabs as an extension of the conflict between East and West. And he not only supplied Israel with everything they needed, overruling Kissinger, but also called the U.S. Navy to the front of the Mediterranean and raised the nuclear readiness of the United States, nuclear arsenal to Orange, which is one before nuclear war, and the Russian who threatened Israel to send troops to assist Egypt and Syria backed off. The memories of those tanks and airplanes and ammunition made it easier for me 8 years after the war to join the U.S. Navy while I was already in the United States after my training. And I served with them for 27 years. I learned very quickly to appreciate working with people who helped us when we needed them. I always felt great admiration for the Israeli military. We were able to do projects together with the Israeli Medical Corps and help the safety of the U.S. military and U.S. civilians with collaborative work we did with Israel. And the collaboration still goes on today. There are many more issues I would like to discuss with you, such as the effect of religion on war and how people who are religious cope with it. What other innovations make it possible to survive the war? But unfortunately, time limits don't allow it. These can be found in my
Dr. Brook, I thank you very, very much for your presentation. And I would like to open the floor for questions. Those who have questions, please raise your hand. Rabbi.
Thank you, Jerry. Itzhak, Toda Rabah, thank you for sharing in such a passionate and fascinating way your personal experience. In the flyer for today, it said the Yom Kippur War that changed Israel. I'd like for you to share with us what you mean by that, and in what way did the war, that particular war, change Israel for forever?
It changed Israel in many ways. It, first of all, illustrated to Israelis that having land doesn't prevent war. It showed them that they can never sleep on their watch, and they have to be proactive to protect themselves, as has happened in destroying the nuclear reactors in Iraq and Syria, also in starting wars themselves, not always with good results, such as the wars in Lebanon. It also changed the government, Labour, who ruled the country until then, and actually was in many ways the government at the time was responsible for the failures that I mentioned, lost power, and the right wing started to be the most dominant party, where Begin became a prime minister a couple of years later. It showed Israelis that military force, even though it's important, it cannot be a guarantee for peace. And in a very tragic way, it left many people broken for life. Those who lost family, and also the many Israelis who had PTSD until today. Many of them are still untreated because of the war and the trauma that it caused in them.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions for Dr. Brook?
If I may, I just want to add a very brief comment. I was a graduate student at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York at the time of Yom Kippur War, and there were many students from Israel, many young people. The impression that I will never forget is how they rushed back home to their units to service without a moment's hesitation. It was very, very impressive and admirable.
Yeah, and there were many people who came from overseas during the war. I talked about it in the book. One of my classmates who was doing a fellowship in psychiatry in New York, he came to the war, and I actually met him in the field hospital that I was evacuated to, caring for soldiers with PTSD. He was one of many others from my class who came back to serve.
Dr. Brook, how did you find yourself immigrating to the United States? What brought you here?
I decided that it's also, I talk it in the book, in the epilogue and in the beginning. I planned to go to a fellowship immediately after the war, because I just finished my residency in Israel and I was already accepted to a program in UCLA before the war. Actually, the evening before the war, I got a letter of acceptance. So we did move to Los Angeles about 10 months after the war. And I ended up, for many reasons, staying. It wasn't really a planned leaving, but just one thing led to another.
Closeness and the ability to contact.
Saul, did you have a question, Saul? Saul, you're muted. You're muted, Saul.
All right now?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Brooks, my question relates to PTSD and its effect upon soldiers in war. Israel is a very small country, and I presume that people have the opportunity to contact family, friends, etc., even during wartime. I think that contributes to PTSD more so than in old wars, like when I was in Korea. The opportunity to talk to family and friends in the evening after there had been a battle, and then go back to the confusion and the frightening situations that occur in battle. I wonder what your thoughts are about that situation.
We were not able to contact anybody during the war. It was in an era that there were no cell phones, and the communication, even the regular communication, was non-existent. But after the war, what really helped was that we met friends and family, and many of us openly talked about what happened, and that helped a lot. It helped me. But there were many people that, for a variety of reasons, did not talk about what happened to them. There were some lectures I gave that I met veterans of the war who shared with me that they kept whatever happened to them to themselves. And yes, it helps to have friends and a close-knit society, but it still is not the cure to the traumas that people suffer from. Israel had very little experience or knowledge about PTSD then, but unfortunately the ongoing conflict led to Israel becoming one of the major nations in the world who had studied PTSD, and is one of the leaders in the field, as is the United States now, after the recent wars that the military had to fight in the Middle East.
Any other questions? Please raise your hand.
Gerald. Yeah, yes, it's Robert. First of all, I commend you, Dr. Brook, for everything that you've accomplished. You can well imagine that after 30 years, I've heard hundreds of speakers. Yours was quite inspiring. So first of all, I just want you to know that I was just informed that in your honor and for what you did and you accomplished and everything, this temple will be making a sizable investment in Israel bonds in your honor. That's number one. Number two, you said that you heard the term just get over it. Did you get over it, or did you get treated for PTSD? And number two, are you still in touch? Are they alive, any of your comrades?
I kept in touch with some of my friends, the medics. I did not get any treatment to PTSD, but in many ways the war never left me, and I live it almost every day. I don't think I suffer from any symptoms of PTSD, but I did choose to go to get treated about 3 years ago to the Veteran Administration as a Navy retiree, and I have to tell you that I went for 12 sessions and they were superb. They allowed me to relive my experiences and learn how to cope with some of the symptoms of hypervigilance and expecting trouble and problems as I used to have, and it did help. So I think I'm happy to say that this country is well equipped to deal with what our own veterans suffer. The problem is that there are not enough therapists in the VA system to help everybody, and in many ways still many people deny it and don't look for help that is available.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I got one more, Jerry, if that's okay. Is that all right?
Okay, sure.
Okay. Dr. Brook, we celebrated tonight Yom Yerushalayim. You mentioned in your talk that you also fought in the 6-day war, and when you heard about the that the Temple Mount was in our hands, you were not able to rejoice because your mind was on all of the soldiers who had lost their lives. Many of us look today at Israel, and I wasn't at the beginning of our program, but knowing the cantor, I'm sure that there was a very upbeat experience of rejoicing in the reunification of Jerusalem and everything that Israel is today, the miracle of the energy and the positive experience that is part of the Israel that so many of us know and love. Tonight, you've shared with us a personal, real perspective as an Israeli, as a soldier, as a medic, as someone who lives that war every day. I'm wondering if you could make a comment about Israel today and what your thought or your vision is for the future. You did say that the change that the Yom Kippur War brought is some of what we see today in the amazing resilience and the understanding that above all else, we've got to be strong. But the question is, we've got to be strong for what Jewish life and what Israeli life is all about. So I'd like for you to share your vision, your current experience. Do you have family in Israel? And what do you think about the day Yom Yerushalayim as a day of celebration?
I have many friends in Israel and family. I visit Israel very often. I read Israeli paper and watch Israeli TV every day. and I call it liberated, but I was still aware of the major meaning of this moment. I used to live on the border all the years that I was in medical school. I lived on the border with Jordan. From my window I could see the old city walls, and I never dreamt I'll be there. And for me, yes, part of me was happy, but it was a very painful day because of what I experienced. And I was only less than a mile from the walls when I heard about it. So it is a great accomplishment that Israel was able to get back the old city. But Israel has a lot of issues to solve, and you can see what's happening these days. How there are conflicts with the Palestinian about the city, the old city, and the story is still evolving. Unfortunately, things are not calm, and peace is not in the horizon, but in the shadow of the Holocaust. We have to try to do our best to survive in Israel and flourish and overcome all the issues and get to some kind of a peaceful existence with our former enemies and our neighbors.
I would like to ask one question, if I may. Considering the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and considering that Saudi Arabia is allowing Israel, I believe, to use its airspace, do you think that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel has improved and might it lead to much better relationships, and maybe Saudi Arabia would recognize Israel one day?
Well, I hope that the Middle East will continue to change, and Israel will get more friends, and the conflict today is between the Shiite and the Sunni, between Iran and Turkey, and Israel and Egypt and Jordan and the Gulf states. So hopefully the Middle East will keep changing, and hopefully one day even a coexistence with Iran would be possible.
Does anyone else have any question for Dr. Brook? Dr. Brook, I want to thank you very, very much for an excellent presentation and for your time. And we thank you for your service to Israel and the United States. God bless you.
Thank you. It was an honor to present to you. And happy Jerusalem Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would, before we close our program, I see that Don Foreman is here from Israel, from Florida, and I'd like to ask Don, who has been the chairman of our Israel Bonds program for many, many years, if you have anything that you would like to say, Don. Let me give you the spotlight. And there you are, Don.
The only thing I would like to say is that it is such a delight to know that our temple has been having Israel Bond breakfasts for, I can't recall, maybe 40 years. I did it for maybe 30 odd years, and other people did it for many years before me. And I think it's just amazing that our shul has done and will continue to try to show our support for the state of Israel by lending Israel our money. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. And so perhaps we can end this evening. We're going to call upon our Chazan. And first, I want to thank Cantor Schron for being there when I wasn't able to be there. And as always, Cantor Schron is my right-hand man, and we're very grateful for the first part of this evening's program. And I would like to ask Cantor Schron to lead us in the singing of Hatikva. Hatikva, Israel's national anthem. Liot am chofshi be'artzeinu, be'eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim, to be a free people in our own land. A dream that has been realized, but it's only been realized by the kinds of dedication that we heard tonight from Dr. Brook and all of the members of the IDF and those who have come to the defense of not only Israel, our land, but Israel, our people, for we are all one family. So on Shabbos, I always say, just because you're mute doesn't mean that you shouldn't sing, and doesn't mean that we're not all singing together. The problem is that Zoom doesn't really allow us to sing together. So I'd like to invite everyone to please rise, as I'd like to highlight Cantor Schron. And we're going to conclude with the words Hatikva, the hope that was for 2,000 years to be a free people and a free land, in our own land. We are so fortunate that we in our own day are living that dream being a reality. And tonight's program, I know it's helped me, but I hope that it has helped all of us to understand that, yes, there is a price for peace, but the prize is worth that price. And may there be a day when there is war no more. Chazan?
Kulot balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiya ulfatei mizrach kadima ayin lezion Sophia od lovda tikvadenu hatikva mat shnot dabayim li odam chofshi be'arteinu Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim li odam chofshi be'arteinu Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim.
And on a high note, we conclude with Sisu et Yerushalayim Giluva. Sisu et Yerushalayim Giluva, Giluva kol ohavea, kol ohavea. Sisu et Yerushalayim Giluva, Kiluva kolo havea, kolo havea. Suet Yerushalayim Kiluva. Kiluva kolo havea, kolo havea. Suet Yerushalayim Kiluva. Kiluva kolo havea. A good night to everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and a happy Yom Yerushalayim. And we'll see you soon.